There are several ways to get data into and out of Matlab. In this video, I'm going to show you a few of the easier ways to get data into the Matlab workspace. There are also slightly more complicated or more flexible ways of importing data, and those methods rely on control statements that I haven't yet taught you in the course, so you will learn a little bit later in the course additional methods to import data. So these are like the easy methods here. If you have data in a text file or a spreadsheet, you can literally just copy them and paste them right into Matlab. So here I'm copying, this is an Excel data file. So I'm copying these numbers here, not the headers, col1 and col2, because I'm just going to import the numbers here. So I copy these numbers and then I paste them in here like this. And the main important thing to note here is that you have to encase the data in square brackets, of course, because we are concatenating. So now I can run this cell by pressing Control Enter, and then I type whos, and we see our data is 15 rows and 2 columns. So that's exactly the data that we had in Excel. So this is a really good method. It's really convenient. It's very easy. You don't have to worry about all sorts of weird file importing issues. The main limitation, of course, with this method is that it's not really scalable. So if you have a lot of data to import, obviously, or if you have, many files to import, or if you have to import a couple of files but many times, then obviously this is not a good method. But this is probably the easiest way to get data into Matlab, just copying and pasting. It's great for small data sets. Okay, next I'm going to show you how to input data if you have a text file that contains only numbers in a regular matrix. So all the rows have the same number of numbers, the same number of elements. In that case, you can simply use the load function. So I'm going to load this data set, testdatafile.txt, and the output of the load function is going to be this variable data. So we run this. We don't get any errors here. So if you get an error when running this command, it's probably because this data file is not in the current folder where you are currently working in, or it's not in Matlab's path. So you might need to change the folder or change the path or move this data file into your current working folder. Okay, so now we can see what these data look like. So I'm going to type data, and this is just a matrix. Here you can see what this data file looks like. So this is the text data, and you can see that Matlab just imported all of these numbers. So if you have nicely, cleanly formatted data that is in a regular matrix or a vector of just numbers, no text or anything, just numbers, then you can just use this load function. That's really easy. Here I'm going to show you a slightly more advanced way of doing the same thing, and this is using a Matlab function called UI get file. So the UI stands for user interface, so user interface get file, and that's going to bring up a pop-up menu that will allow us to choose a specific file on the on your computer. So I'm going to run this line of code, and see this opens up a new selection window here, and now I'm going to click on this testdatafile.txt file. Okay, now this line on its own doesn't actually import the data. Instead, what it does is return two outputs. We have an output for the data file name and an output for the file path. So now by combining the file path and the file name, we can then concatenate these. So I concatenate the file path and then the file name, and then we can use the load function. So this method will work if the data file is in the Matlab path, meaning it's in the current folder or somewhere in the path that you specify. This method will work always, regardless of where the file is. Of course, the only disadvantage of this is also not really a scalable method, because if you have to import, let's say you have to import 60 files, you don't want to have to, worry about this interface button opening up 60 times to select each one of these files. Okay, but this is just to show you a nice way. Also, this is a great method, but it doesn't really scale to importing lots and lots of data files. Okay, and then the other thing I want to show you about using the load file is that if you assign an output to the to load to this load function, then the data inside this text file is going to be stored in a matrix called data. So you see that here, it's called data. Now, if you just load in the test data file like this without assigning any output variable, then what Matlab is going to do is put this data file into a variable that has the same name as the data file. So here the data file is called test data file, and now we see a new variable in the workspace called test data file. Now in this case, this variable and this variable data are exactly the same. It's just a question of whether we determine the name of the data variable or whether Matlab automatically determines the name because we didn't specify an output of the load function. Okay, so this is about importing text files. If you are going to be working with Matlab frequently, then actually the best way to store data is using the Matlab format .mat file. And that's what I want to show you here. That's actually really easy to import and also to export. Now, I'm going to show you in the next video how to save data, how to output data in the Matlab format. It's also very simple to do. But in this video, I'm just going to show you how to import, how to load data directly into the workspace using with a mat file. So in fact, it's really the same thing as what I showed up above. So now I've cleared the workspace. We can type whos. We still use the load function. So it's exactly the same load function that we used here. This is for a text data file. Here is for a mat file. So let's see what we get here, what variables we get here. So now this is interesting because above, when we didn't specify an output of the load function, that Matlab created a variable that had the same name as the file. But with a mat file, with a Matlab format data mat file, it works a little bit differently. The variables are stored, including the variable names, are stored in this mat file. So when we load in this mat file, Matlab already knows what variables, what the names of these variables are, because that is stored inside this mat file. So this is just to show you that you can achieve the same result without typing the .mat and without having the parenthesis and the single quotes around here. So this is valid if the file is in the current folder or in the Matlab path, and if the file is a Matlab format file, then Matlab will basically assume, if it doesn't see an extension, it will assume that the extension is .mat. Okay, now you can still request an output of the load function even if the variable names are stored inside the mat file. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to clear the workspace, load in exactly the same file. So the file is exactly the same. Now I'm assigning an output to the load function, and we can see that we no longer see these variable names in the workspace. Instead, we just see one single variable called data, which was the output of the load function. But you can see when you look at the class, this is actually a structure. So let's see what this structure looks like. I'm just going to type data, and it's going to tell me that it has the following fields: var A, var B, and var C. No surprise, these are the variables that were loaded directly into the workspace using, or when we didn't request an output, assign an output to the load function. So this is actually quite useful because sometimes you have different variables with different values, but the variable names are the same in different mat files. So if that happens, if you have different data with the same variable name, then you can use this method to call this, you might call this data 1, and then data 2 would be a different mat file, but with the same variable names containing different data. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to import Microsoft formatted Excel files. So that is files that end in XLS or XLSX. Now, one warning about, well, I have two warnings, but the first warning about this function is that it only works if you have Microsoft Office installed on your computer. So that, if you're using Windows or Mac, then this is likely to work because most people have Microsoft Office installed on their computer. This is mainly a limitation for a Linux computer. So if you're using a Linux computer, then this is probably not going to run. Now, the second warning I would like to give you about this XLS read function is that you have to be careful with the outputs of this function because they can generate some confusion, and I'm going to show you that now. So XLS read will give you up to 3 outputs. So I'm calling these number data, text data, and raw data. So let's import this. I'm going to run this line. And let us type whos to see what we have here. So notice raw data is 16 rows by 2 columns. Number data is 15 rows by 2 columns. And text data is 1 row and 2 columns. And you can ignore data. I think I'll even clear this just so it's not confusing. So these were the 3 outputs that we got from this function XLS read. The number data, the text data, and the raw data. Now it's no shock, it's no surprise that 1 plus 15 equals 16. So let's see what these variables look like. So number data looks like this. It's a 2 columns of data. In fact, this is the same data that I showed you at the very beginning that I copied and pasted. And then we have text data, and that is col1 and col2. You might remember that these were the column headers that I showed you in the Excel format, in the Excel file. And then we have raw data, and this actually contains cells. These are cell arrays, but this contains all the information, including the text headers, the string headers, and all of the number values. And that you see here as well. We can see raw data is a cell. It's a cell matrix, a matrix of cells, and number data is numeric. It's of class double. So I hope you can see why this is confusing, because the first row of numbered data actually corresponds to the second row in the Excel file. So in the original Excel file, row 2 is where the data start, where the numeric data start. But in this first output, number data, it's actually row 1. So I hope you can see why this gets a little bit confusing. If you are going to be using this function, XLS read, then my recommendation is to ignore the first 2 outputs and just work with the raw data, or with this third output. It might be a little bit more difficult to work with. You might need a little bit of extra code to extract all the numbers out of here. But I think this method will reduce confusion and make sure that you're not accidentally skipping lines when trying to work with the numeric data. All right, so the last thing that I want to show you is importing pictures. Now, I haven't yet showed you about data visualization, how to create figures and axes and graphics and so on. That's coming up a little bit later in the course. But I just want to show you how easy it is to import a picture data file. So here we have a picture. It's called amsterdam.bmp, and you can use the function imread. The im stands for image, so image read, and import this. We will import this into a variable called amsterpic. So now let's type whos, and we can see we have a new variable in the workspace called amsterpic. Of course, that's the output of this imread function. And you can see this is actually a 3-dimensional matrix. It's a cube of numbers. It's 734 by 700 by 3. So you might guess that this corresponds to the pixel width, so the number of pixels wide. This is the number of pixels high. Actually, no, sorry, I got that backwards. It gets a little confusing. So this is the rows, and this is the column. So in fact, this is the number, this is the height. So the image has 734 pixels high. It's 700 columns, so it's 700 pixels wide. And what do you think this 3 stands for? Yeah, I'm sure you guessed it. It's RGB, so it's the red, green, blue channels. So this shows you the color. We can look at this picture. You can use a function image_sc and then amsterpic. And there's other functions as well. So this is just a screenshot of Google Maps showing downtown Amsterdam. So in this video, I showed you several different ways of importing data into the Matlab workspace. These are the easy ways. Hopefully you have your data formatted in a way that you can use one of these methods. Of course, the best one is to have your data, or the most convenient method is to have your data stored in this matlab.mat format. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to export data from MATLAB onto files that you could share with other people. So see you in the next video.